He looked at me the way you look at a cracked plate in a five-star kitchen, something defective, something that should have been thrown out before the guests arrived. My brother's future father-in-law stood at the center of his own flagship restaurant, surrounded by investors and food critics and people whose names appeared in Forbes, and he pointed at the empty breadbasket on our table and said, with the casual authority of a man who had never once questioned his own importance, "Would you mind? Since you work in service, you must know where the kitchen is." He smiled while he said it. That slow, satisfied smile of someone who already knows the punchline before he delivers it. He was so certain I would stand up quietly, smooth my napkin, and disappear into the back like I belonged there. He was so certain I would accept my place in the hierarchy he had spent the last 40 minutes carefully constructing around me. He was so certain that the woman in the outdated blazer sitting at the wrong end of the table had nothing to offer but obedience. He was wrong, but let me start from the beginning. Let me tell you how I ended up sitting in that room, at that table, wearing a blazer I had bought 4 years ago for a completely different life, and why, when I finally spoke, I made sure it was the last time Richard Hargrove ever looked at anyone the way he looked at me. My name is Claire Watkins. I am 31 years old. And for most of the last 3 years, I have been exactly what everyone assumed I was. A line cook at a mid-range hotel restaurant in Columbus, Ohio, plating chicken piccata for business travelers who were already thinking about something else. Before that, I was someone entirely different. The week my brother called to tell me he was engaged, I was standing in the walk-in cooler at the Harrington Hotel, doing inventory with a clipboard and a pen that kept running out of ink. He was so happy I could hear it vibrating through the phone, this uncontainable, almost childlike joy that I had not heard from him since we were kids and our father used to take us fishing on Saturday mornings. "Her name is Vivienne," he told me. Vivienne Hargrove. I knew the name. Anyone who followed the culinary world even casually would know the name. Hargrove Hospitality Group was one of the largest privately owned restaurant companies in the country. 14 properties, 3 of them carrying Michelin recognition, a brand built over 30 years by Richard Hargrove from a single steakhouse in Atlanta into something that people wrote serious business school case studies about. The family was not just wealthy, they were the kind of wealthy that came with architecture with a particular way of existing in the world, a grammar of privilege so deeply embedded it no longer looked like privilege, it just looked like how things were. My brother had been dating Vivienne for 8 months. I had not met her yet. I had barely left Columbus in 3 years. I told him I was happy for him. I told him she sounded wonderful. I meant it completely. And I also felt, in the cold air of the walk-in cooler with the clipboard in my hand, the particular quality of distance that had grown between who I was now and who I used to be, a gap so wide and so quietly devastating that I rarely let myself look directly at it anymore. 3 years ago, I was the sous chef at Maison Laurent in Chicago, which had held 2 Michelin stars for 6 consecutive years. I was 28. My executive chef, Laurent Dubois, had told a food journalist from the Tribune that I had a palate he had seen perhaps twice in his career. I had been nominated for the James Beard Rising Chef Award. I was writing a proposal for my own restaurant. I had a business partner, a location in mind, a concept that I believed in the way you believe in things when you are young enough to think belief is sufficient. Then my father had his first stroke. It happened on a Tuesday in March. He was alone in the house I grew up in a suburb of Columbus, and he was on the kitchen floor for 4 hours before a neighbor noticed the lights were wrong. My brother was living in New York at the time, building a career in finance, and when the hospital called him, he called me, and I drove to Columbus that night without stopping, and I did not go back to Chicago for the restaurant in the way I had expected to. My father recovered from the first stroke, partially. He could walk with a cane, he could speak slowly and carefully, but he could not live alone. And my brother was in New York, and there was no one else. I took a leave of absence from Maison Laurent that extended, month by month, into something that stopped being a leave and became my life instead. I do not tell this story to sound noble. I want to be honest. I resented it sometimes. I resented it in the middle of the night when my father had an episode, and I sat with him in the hospital waiting room reading the same magazine 3 times without absorbing a word. I resented it when I called Laurent to check in. and heard the background sounds of the kitchen at service, and felt a physical ache in my chest, like a door closing somewhere deep inside me. I resented it even as I understood, completely and without reservation, that there was no version of myself that could have done anything differently. My father got better, slowly. He stabilized. He moved into an assisted living facility 18 months ago, comfortable, well cared for, happy in the particular low-key way of someone who has stopped fighting the current and learned to float. And I stayed in Columbus, because by the time he was settled, my life there had calcified into something I did not know how to escape. And the kitchen I had known, the world I had belonged to, felt like a country I had surrendered my passport to. I do not tell people this. Most people at the Harrington know me as Claire, who shows up on time and keeps her station clean and makes the best hollandaise in the building. They do not know about Laurent. They do not know about James Beard, or the restaurant proposal, or the business partner who eventually opened without me and won a Beard Award 2 years later. I stopped talking about my past the way you stop touching a bruise, not because it is not still there, but because you learn that pressing on it accomplishes nothing. So, that is who I was when my brother called about Richard Hargrove. That is the woman who drove to Atlanta for the welcome dinner that Richard Hargrove had organized for his daughter's new fiancé and his family, which in practice meant just me, since our father could not travel. I did not want to go. I told myself I was happy for my brother, which was true, and that a weekend in Atlanta would be fine, which was not entirely true. I packed the best clothes I had, which were not particularly impressive, and I drove to the airport, and I sat in the middle seat of a crowded flight, and I told myself that none of it mattered. It was one dinner. I would smile and be pleasant and go home. I knew it was going to be different from that about 30 seconds after I walked into Hargrove Flagship. The restaurant occupied the ground floor of a building in Midtown Atlanta that Richard Hargrove owned outright, a fact that seemed to be referenced at least once in every sentence anyone spoke in his presence. It was genuinely beautiful dark wood and warm light, and that particular quiet that expensive restaurants cultivate, the acoustic equivalent of a cashmere blanket. The kind of place where the chairs cost more than my monthly rent and the menu does not list prices because if you have to ask, the answer is already no. My brother met me at the door. He looked happier than I had seen him in years, luminous in the way people get when they find someone they did not know they had been waiting for. He hugged me and introduced me to Vivienne, who was warm and genuine and looked at my brother with a softness that made the protective part of me exhale. She was not performing. She actually loved him. I could see it immediately. Her parents were another matter. Richard Hargrove was 61 years old, built like a man who had played college football and never entirely stopped, silver-haired and broad-shouldered, with the posture of someone accustomed to occupying any room he entered on his own terms. He shook my hand with the focused assessment of someone calculating your net worth in real time, and something in his expression, barely perceptible, recalibrated and settled. He had decided what I was before I finished saying hello. Her mother, Diana, was polished in a way that required sustained effort to maintain pearl earrings and a smile that never quite reached her eyes, the practiced warmth of a woman who had spent decades making guests feel welcome in rooms where they did not entirely belong. They seated us at the chef's table, which under other circumstances would have been an honor. Tonight it meant a long rectangular table positioned so that Richard could observe the entire dining room while remaining the unambiguous center of our smaller world. My brother sat next to Vivienne, across from her parents. I was placed at the far end, next to Vivienne's younger brother, a 23-year-old named Carter who spent most of dinner looking at his phone. The evening began pleasantly enough, if you define pleasant as enduring a sustained performance of superiority so polished it almost reads as manners. Richard asked my brother about his work in finance, listened with the attentive focus of someone grading a presentation, and offered occasional commentary that was framed as encouragement but functioned as a measurement. Good. Not extraordinary. Acceptable. For now. My brother, who is genuinely excellent at his job, navigated it with more grace than I would have managed. Then Richard turned to me. "So, Claire," he said, "Vivienne tells me you work in the restaurant industry as well." The phrase "as well" was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. "I'm a line cook at a hotel restaurant in Columbus," I said. "It's good work." He nodded slowly, the nod of a man receiving information he already considered irrelevant. A hotel restaurant. Richard said it the way you might say a community theater production of a Broadway show, in Columbus. That's right. Diana smiled from across the table. That must be rewarding. Feeding people every day. The condescension was so thoroughly embedded in the kindness that I suspected she did not even hear it herself anymore. The dinner proceeded. Course after course arrived, each one impeccable, because Richard had obviously instructed the kitchen to perform at the absolute ceiling of its capability tonight. He narrated the dishes with the proprietary pride of someone who had built all of this from nothing, and he had, genuinely, and I found myself in the strange position of respecting the achievement while disliking the man doing the explaining. The restaurant's signature dish arrived at the third course. A slow braised short rib with a reduction sauce that the menu described, I could see from the printed card at the table, as Chef's Heritage Sauce, Hargrove Family Recipe. I looked at the plate for a moment. Then I picked up my fork and ate without saying anything. Richard was watching me. Not in an obvious way, but I was a chef, and I understood what it meant when someone at a table monitors how their food lands. Remarkable, isn't it? He said. That sauce is the reason this restaurant exists, in a way. I developed it over years, tweaking the balance, the depth. People have offered me extraordinary amounts of money for that recipe, and I have never sold it. Some things are worth more than money. They're worth your name. My brother looked at me briefly across the table. He did not know. I had never told him. That's a beautiful sentiment, I said, and my voice was perfectly steady. Diana leaned forward, pivoting in the way people do when they want to redirect an energy they sense is gathering. She asked Vivienne about the wedding venue, and Vivienne answered, and the table breathed, and Richard settled back into his chair with the satisfaction of a man who has made his point and expects it to hold. But he was not finished with me. Over the following hour, the observations accumulated. Richard mentioned, in the context of discussing the restaurant's wine program, that he found people without formal culinary training often lacked the theoretical foundation to truly understand flavor development. He mentioned, when the subject of the Atlanta food scene came up, that certain dining concepts appealed to people for whom accessibility matters more than excellence. He mentioned, when my brother said something kind about the Harrington's seasonal menu, that hotel restaurants served an important function for travelers who simply needed fuel. Each observation was technically about something else. None of them were about me. All of them were. My brother's jaw was getting tighter. Vivienne kept glancing at her father with an expression I recognized. The look of someone watching a person they love do something they cannot stop. I said nothing. I ate my food. I asked Carter what he was studying in school, and he said business, and I asked him what he wanted to do after. And he shrugged and said his father would probably figure something out. I watched the room. I listened to the kitchen, the rhythms that bleed through swinging doors, the particular percussion of a service that is running well. The bread basket had been empty for 20 minutes. A server passed by, and Richard raised his hand, but the server had already turned, already absorbed into the controlled chaos of a busy floor. Richard watched them go with the particular impatience of a man unaccustomed to waiting for anything. He turned to me. "Would you mind?" he said, his tone gentle, almost apologetic, performing courtesy with the expertise of a man who knows exactly what he is doing. "Since you work in service, you must know where the kitchen is." The table went absolutely still. My brother's hand moved toward his water glass and then stopped. Vivienne looked at her father with an expression I could not entirely read, something between familiar pain and the desperate hope that I would simply comply, that the next 60 seconds would pass without incident, that we could all agree to let this be what it appeared to be. A thoughtful request, rather than what it actually was. I looked at Richard Hargrove. I held his gaze for 3 seconds. 4. The polite response was forming somewhere, the smooth deflection, the small laugh that signals I understand we are all pretending this is a reasonable thing to say. I chose a different response. "I do know where the kitchen is," I said. "And I'll tell you something interesting about that kitchen, since we're talking about it." Richard's expression did not change. He was too practiced for that. But something shifted behind his eyes, a slight recalculation. "I was the one who developed that sauce," I said. The table became a different kind of still. I continued, because I had started and there was no version of stopping that served anyone now. 3 years ago, a culinary development firm hired me as a consultant for a 6-week project. They were working with a hospitality group that wanted to revitalize their flagship's identity around a single signature element. I was brought in as a specialist in reduction-based flavor profiles. I spent 3 weeks testing ratios, adjusting the base, building the depth of the tannin integration with the fat content. The final formulation was mine. I looked at the plate in front of Richard. The blackberry in the secondary note. The way the acidity opens at the back of the palate instead of the front. That's a specific inversion technique that I'd only seen done once before, in Lyon, by a chef named Brassard, who retired in 2018. I adapted it. It took me 11 attempts to get the integration right. I set down my fork. I don't know what they told you about where it came from. I was paid for the recipe outright and I signed a confidentiality agreement that I'm not violating right now because I'm not sharing the formula. I'm just telling you what I know about the thing you've been describing as your family recipe for, I assume, several years. The silence stretched. Richard Hargrove was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on him all evening. Not warmth, not respect, not yet. Something more fundamental. The expression of a man who has reached for the ground and found that it has moved. That's, he said, and stopped. My brother was staring at me. I had not told him any of this. Had not told anyone. Had told myself I had no reason to tell anyone because it did not matter. Because who I had been before Columbus was not who I was now, and it was better to keep those two lives in separate rooms inside myself where they could not collapse into each other. But Richard had opened that door when he pointed at the breadbasket. The culinary development firm was Crestline Associates, I said. The project code was RF14. They retained me through a former colleague at Maison Laurent, where I worked for 4 years before I left Chicago to care for my father. At the name Maison Laurent, something changed in Richard's posture. The name meant something to anyone in the industry. 2 Michelin stars, Laurent Dubois. You worked at Maison Laurent, Richard said slowly. I was the sous chef for my last 2 years there. Before that, I staged in Paris and did a year in Copenhagen. I left to come home when my father had a stroke. He is doing well, thank you for not asking. The last sentence landed harder than I intended it to. Or perhaps exactly as hard as I intended it to. Vivienne made a sound that was not quite a word. My brother exhaled through his nose in the way he does when he is trying not to say something. Richard looked at me for a long moment, and I watched him do what people rarely do in real time. I watched him genuinely reconsider. Not perform reconsideration. Actually do it. Process the gap between what he had assumed and what I had just told him. Measure the distance between his version of me and the version I had just described, and understand that he had gotten it badly wrong. A server appeared at Richard's shoulder not with a breadbasket, but with a man who was wearing a chef's whites and a particular expression of polite apology. Mr. Hargrove, the server said quietly. Chef Moreau was hoping to say hello to your guests if this was an appropriate time. Richard nodded without taking his eyes off me. Alain Moreau had been consulting for Hargrove Hospitality Group for 2 years. He was 54, French-born, trained at 3-star establishments in Lyon and Paris before building an American career that included a period, roughly a decade ago, as a guest chef at a festival in Chicago where we had spent 2 days working side by side at adjacent stations. He was one of the most technically rigorous people I had ever cooked with, and he had told me then, during a break, when we were both eating standing up because there was nowhere to sit, that I had better instincts than anyone he had seen in 15 years. He walked to the table. He saw Richard. He saw my brother and Vivienne. He saw me. The recognition was immediate and unguarded. Claire Watkins, he said, and there was genuine warmth in it, the warmth of someone greeting a peer they had not expected to encounter here. I heard you had left Chicago. I tried to find out where you had gone. We had some family circumstances, I said. He nodded, the nod of someone who understands that this sentence contains a full story and does not require excavation. He looked at the table, at the plate in front of Richard, and I watched his expression move through something I could not entirely follow. Then he looked at Richard Hargrove. You know, Alain said, with the particular directness of someone who has spent enough decades in professional kitchens to have no patience remaining for social performance. I have been trying to understand the heritage of this sauce since you brought me on. The technique is unusual, very specific. I thought perhaps I recognized the approach, but I could not source it. He looked at me. Now I understand. Richard said nothing. Claire was one of the most talented young chefs I encountered in my entire American career, Alain said to the table, in the tone of someone providing information they consider simply factual. If she left Laurent to come home to her family, the industry lost something significant. He said this without drama, without emphasis, the way you state a measurement. The table was very quiet. I am not going to pretend that the next portion of the evening was comfortable. It was not. Richard Hargrove was a man who had built his identity around knowing the value of things, and he had spent 2 hours demonstrating, in every indirect way available to him, that he had assessed mine and found it negligible. He now had to reckon with the fact that his assessment was wrong, that his family's signature dish existed in the form it did because of a woman he had just asked to fetch bread, and that the most respected culinary consultant he had ever hired had just introduced me to his dinner table as someone the industry had lost something significant by not having. He was not graceful about it. At first, he attempted a version of recovery where my expertise became something he had sensed all along, a quality he had perhaps expressed himself poorly in communicating his appreciation for. I watched him try this, and I watched my brother watch him try it, and I watched Vivienne look at her father with the particular love and frustration of someone who has seen this pattern before and wished, every single time, that it would resolve differently. I did not help him and I did not punish him. I had not come to Atlanta to do either of those things. There is something I want to say about what happened next, because I think it is the part that actually matters. Richard Hargrove did not apologize that night. Not a real apology, not the kind that costs something. He made adjustments, his tone shifted. He asked me questions about my work that were genuine rather than performative. He refilled my wine glass himself rather than signaling the server. These were not nothing. They were also not the same as accountability. What happened instead was that Vivienne, after dinner, when her parents had stepped away to speak with the manager and my brother had gone to use the phone, sat down next to me at the now empty table and said, quietly, "He does this with everyone at first. He did it to my college roommate. He did it to my mother's sister. He did it to the architect who designed this building. He decides what someone is worth in the first 5 minutes, and he treats them accordingly until something forces him to recalculate." She looked at the table. "I'm sorry you had to be the something tonight." I told her it was all right. I meant it partially. She said, "I'm going to marry your brother because he is one of the only people I have ever met who does not do any version of what my father just did. He just looks at people. He just actually sees them." I thought about my brother at 16, driving me to school after I missed the bus, arguing with me about music the entire way, never once suggesting I was less interesting than the conversation he would rather be having. I thought about him calling me from New York every Sunday during the worst period after my father's stroke, not with solutions, just with presence, just with the simple ongoing signal that someone was there. "Yeah," I said, "that's pretty much him." The flight home was unremarkable. Columbus was cold and flat and familiar in the way that things become familiar when they are all you have, a comfort made of resignation that you eventually stop distinguishing from actual peace. I went back to work on Monday. I plated chicken piccata. I made hollandaise for tables of business travelers who were thinking about something else. 3 weeks later, I got a call from a number I did not recognize. The area code was Atlanta. It was Richard Hargrove. He did not lead with an apology. I did not expect one. He said, "I spoke to Alain after you left. At length, he told me things about your history that I should have known before dinner. I understand that you have been through a significant period of personal and professional sacrifice, and that the circumstances under which you left the industry were not a reflection of your commitment or capability." There was a pause. "I behaved badly toward you," he said. "I made assumptions that were wrong, and I expressed them in a way that was disrespectful. I would like to do better." I sat with that for a moment. It was not a perfect apology. It was, I suspected, the most direct acknowledgement of wrongdoing that Richard Hargrove had offered anyone in a long time, possibly ever. "I appreciate that," I said. "Thank you." Another pause. "Alain has also told me that you have a concept. A restaurant concept that you developed before you left Chicago. He said it is the kind of concept that does not exist yet, and should." My throat tightened. "I would like to hear about it," Richard said, "if you are willing. No obligations, no expectations, just a conversation." I looked around my apartment. Cookbooks stacked on every surface. A folder on my desk that I had not opened in 2 years, labeled with a restaurant name I had come up with during a walk along the Chicago River on a morning that felt like a different century. "Okay," I said. "I'm willing. I want to be clear about what the conversation became, because it would be easy to tell this story as a fairy tale, and that would not be honest. Richard Hargrove did not write me a check and hand me a restaurant. What he did was more complicated and more real than that. He connected me with investors he had developed relationships with over 3 decades. He introduced me to a real estate contact in a market where my concept might work. He made one phone call to Laurent Dubois, who made one phone call to a food writer at a national magazine who had been looking, he said, for exactly this kind of story. The negotiations were difficult. There were months where I was not sure it would come together. There were investors who passed, a lease that fell through, a partner I had thought was committed who turned out not to be. Richard advised without directing. He offered resources without attaching conditions. He was, in that period, a genuinely different person from the man who had pointed at a breadbasket and invited me to fetch it. I do not think people fundamentally change. But I think some people, when they are finally forced to see themselves accurately, choose to do something useful with that clarity. Richard was one of them. My restaurant opened 14 months after that dinner in Atlanta. It is small, 42 seats, in a neighborhood in Columbus that did not have anything like it yet. The menu is built around a single organizing principle that I had been refining in my head for 3 years while plating hotel chicken. The idea that the most sophisticated flavor developments in culinary history have come from constraint, from making something extraordinary with limited ingredients, from necessity generating invention. Alain Moreau came to the opening. Laurent Dubois sent a bottle of wine and a handwritten note that I still have in the drawer of my desk. My father came in his wheelchair and ate the tasting menu at a table near the window and told me it was the best thing he had ever tasted. And whether that was entirely accurate or not, it was the sentence I had been waiting 3 years to hear. My brother came with Vivienne. Richard and Diana came too. A choice that I had not entirely expected and that I understood when I saw them walk through the door, as the kind of gesture that does not require words to communicate its meaning. Richard ordered the tasting menu. When the 3rd course arrived, a braise with a reduction that I had built over 6 months of testing, the dish I was most proud of on the menu, he tasted it and set down his fork and looked at me from across the room with an expression I did not have a name for. He raised his glass in my direction. Not a toast, not a performance, just the simple, private acknowledgement of one person recognizing the quality of another's work. I nodded once and turned back to my kitchen. Here is what I know now that I did not fully understand the night I sat at that table in Atlanta, being treated like furniture in my brother's future family's story. The years in Columbus were not a detour. They were not a punishment or a waste or a period to be erased from the narrative of who I am. They were the years when I learned what I actually valued, when I discovered that the drive I felt toward cooking was not about ambition or recognition or proving something to people like Richard Hargrove. It was about the work itself. The sauce, the reduction, the 11 attempts before the integration was right. The thing I had done in a development kitchen 3 years ago, not because anyone would know I did it, but because I could not bring myself to turn in anything less than exact. The night my brother's father-in-law pointed at a breadbasket and invited me to make myself useful, I had 2 choices. I could smooth my napkin and stand up and go find a server, and we could all agree that this was what had happened. A small request, a courtesy extended from a woman in service to a man accustomed to being served. Or I could tell him the truth. The truth was not a weapon. I want to be clear about that, because it would be flattering but dishonest to pretend I rose from my chair at that table full of righteous certainty, armed and ready. I was not. I was tired and I was stung, and I was also underneath everything. Just a person who had spent 3 years becoming invisible and was suddenly, in the compressed and specific pressure of that particular moment, no longer willing to agree to it. I told him what I knew because it was true, and because silence in that moment would have been its own kind of lie. Some silences are patient, some silences are strategic, and some silences are simply the sound of a person agreeing to disappear. I had been disappearing long enough. My restaurant was reviewed in 3 publications in its first 6 months. One of the reviewers wrote, in a sentence that I have not entirely figured out how to hold, that the food suggested a chef who had spent years learning what she was not willing to compromise on. I read that sentence sitting on the floor of my empty restaurant at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, the kitchen dark and the chairs still upended on the tables, and I thought about my father in the hospital waiting room, and the Chicago River in the morning, and a breadbasket in an Atlanta restaurant, and 11 attempts at a reduction before the integration was finally, undeniably right. Sometimes the thing that saves you looks like starting over. Sometimes it just looks like telling the truth at dinner. If you have ever been placed at the wrong end of the table and treated like background, I want you to know this. The people doing the placing are almost always wrong about the reasons why. They see a moment in time. They see a job title, a zip code, a blazer that is not quite right for the room. They do not see the years. They do not see what you carry, or what you know, or what you are in the process of becoming. Let them underestimate you. Let them point at the breadbasket. And then, when the moment is right, let them find out exactly who they were talking to.